I'm Phil Netto, and welcome back to Deconstructing Lewiston-Auburn and Maine History, and episode 4 and part 4 of the final segment of the Lewiston Raytheon story. In this episode, you will discover how Raytheon finally found a tenant for their Lewiston plant and get up to date on what is currently happening with the building. We will also provide the viewer some context about how the simultaneous 1952 creations of the Lewiston Industrial Development Department and the Lewiston Development Corporation led to a number of business development successes that encouraged not only Lewiston leaders, but Auburn leaders as well to create their own economic development position and citizen-led development corporation in 1955. The viewer will also learn how Auburn's economic development efforts struggled soon after being created, but would go on to land a major manufacturing operation in 1962. The company's arrival became the genesis for Auburn's successful efforts to recruit other national companies in the mid-1960s. Additionally, we will review how Raytheon's arrival and departure would leave its mark outside of Lewiston and Auburn. Somebody named Dimitri Grabay would benefit from Raytheon's departure after his failed effort to buy the company's building. That experience created a path for his new company to locate in Lisbon, Maine. It is also possible that the greater Portland area also benefited and continues to benefit from the Raytheon Company's Lewiston decision, which I will argue could have influenced Fairchild Semiconductor's 1962 decision on where to locate their first plant outside of California. So please enjoy episode 4 of Deconstructing Lewiston-Auburn and Maine History and the last segment of the Lewiston Raytheon story. Lewiston Economic Development Director Sam Michael was part of Lewiston's leadership effort that brought Raytheon to the city, but resigned May 7, 1965 to take another position in Oxford County, Maine. Michael also left his position to manage the local and state logistics associated with a major national and international Lewiston event in which he played a major role to attract: the May 25, 1965 heavyweight championship rematch between Muhammad Ali and Sonny Liston. Shortly after Michael's departure, he shared with the Portland Sunday Telegram that the championship fight would, quote, mean more than $1 million in publicity for Lewiston-Auburn and the state of Maine, unquote. Although Michael unsuccessfully tried to find a tenant for Raytheon, who announced their closure on March 1, 1963, his observation about the fight's public relations value may have produced an opportunity to sell the Raytheon property not long after his departure. 2 days after Michael's successful effort to help stage the city's and the state's heavyweight championship fight, the Lewiston Daily Sun reported that Michael's new successor could be named as soon as May 27th. On June 7, 1965, Mayor Robert Couturier announced the appointment of Louis C. Sarolis to become the city's new economic development officer. He would begin his new duties on June 21st, and finding a tenant for the Raytheon building would be one of his top priorities. Whether it was fate, good luck, or $1 million worth of free public relations, Sarolis was contacted about a development inquiry that Michael pursued for over 2 years. The Lewiston Evening Journal reported on July 23, 1965, that Louis Sarolis and the Lewiston Development Corporation had been negotiating the sale of the Raytheon building, quote, for some weeks, unquote. An individual named Dimitri G. Grabay and his company, the Maine Research Corporation, were confirmed to be involved, but Sarolis added that, quote, he was not at liberty to discuss the matter, unquote. The news from Sarolis was timely. Several weeks prior to the Raytheon inquiry, the local press polled the Lewiston City Council asking how they felt about the Cape Elizabeth man now filling the economic development post. The poll revealed that only 2 aldermen were unequivocally supportive of the Finance Board's selection. 3 aldermen believed that the local person should have been selected, but one did qualify his statement, saying he would still support Saros, while the remaining 2 aldermen had no comment. One of the aldermen choosing not to comment was George Call, the same alderman who months before cut Sam Michael's fiscal year 65-66 industrial department budget and believed that Lewiston's constituents saw the economic development as a quote unquote big joke. Saros would not let the alderman's unsupportive position distract him, and he remained focused on the Raytheon negotiations. Although there was little confirmation from the city or state about the ongoing Raytheon discussions. News about Dimitri Grabé negotiating with the city went public during an August 10, 1965 conference with Governor John Reed, representatives from Raytheon, the state DED, Department of Economic Development, the LDC, Lewiston Development Corporation, Louis Sarolis, and Dimitri Grabé, and George Brownell from the Maine Research Corporation, MRC. In the article, Grabé stated that he had been in negotiations with Raytheon since March 1965, but made no mention of discussions with the LDC or Michael, who was the development director at the time. On September 27th, the Lewiston Evening Journal reported that Grabé was meeting on October 12th with officials from the DED, the Employment Security Commission, and the LDC for a slideshow that would explain what the MRC would manufacture in Lewiston. The first Manufacturers National Bank meeting attracted some 60 people and was hosted by Louis Sarolis and the DED's Raymond Curtis. During the slide presentation, Grabé told his audience about high demand for, quote, printed circuits, unquote, and that production orders were exceeding capacities for the 4 national companies producing the units. Grabé's background provided him the credibility needed to sell his project. He was the son of white Russian immigrants who fled their country following the Communist Revolution. As a Yugoslavian native, he had, quote, received his technical training at Technische Hochschule University in Munich in 1950, unquote, was employed by Watches for Switzerland Incorporated in New York, and served as a, quote, consulting engineer for MIT, unquote, for the Mariner Space Probe project. Grabé projected that the new Lewiston MRC location would initially employ 100 people, and by the 5th year increase to 450. He also said that there was a possibility that the, quote, top employment number could be 3 times that amount, slightly exceeding the 1962 peak Raytheon number of 1,300 employees if achieved. Except for the Raytheon building being a possible site for a Job Corps project, news about MRC and their city negotiations for the building went silent. That would change when a December 19th newspaper reported about Auburn's recent development successes increasing tensions between the cities. The article also revealed that Mayor Couturier and Sarolis said that the city was very close to finalizing development deals with, quote, several big prospects, unquote, but refused to provide any details. Couturier and Sarolis had no comment about the MRC negotiations, but the newspaper reported that sources said the MRC project had run into some, quote unquote, critical problems, and that some Lewiston officials were blaming the DED, quote, for complicating the negotiations, unquote, and placing the sale of the building at risk. It was likely that the reports about critical problems in the city's confidence of landing one of several big prospects was disconcerting to Grabé, who had been negotiating since March 1965. He admired the Maine workforce and specifically the Lewiston-Auburn area labor pool. As important as securing the Raytheon site was, Grabé believed that, quote, with or without the Raytheon building, we're going to Maine, unquote. This was an extraordinary statement in that news reports revealed Grabé had all kinds of offers from Pennsylvania to locate his business in that state. That would include a community's offer for 1 year of rent-free use at a reduced rent rate for a vacant General Electric plant. Grabay set aside the very generous Pennsylvania financial incentives because of his confidence in the superiority of the Maine labor pool, citing the dependability of the area's workforce as the primary reason Fairchild Semiconductor decided on the South Portland location in 1962. Grabay also knew that a real estate agent had exclusively listed some of the largest companies in the country who were looked upon as quote unquote acceptable Raytheon building tenants. That would not include startup companies like MRC. Grabay's concerns about the deal were validated when the December 30th, 1965 story broke about RCA's, the Radio Corporation of America's, interest in the Lewiston Raytheon site. Mayor Robert Couturier and Louis Saralis would only say that Lewiston was one of the sites in several states that RCA was considering. The Press Herald also reported that an option on the property was given to, quote, John J. Reynolds Incorporated, a New York real estate firm, to find a tenant for the building by February 1st, unquote. An appraisal had also been recently completed, and RCA representatives surveyed the two cities and their schools and housing for several months. Raytheon also confirmed that negotiations for the building were ongoing, but one thing was certain for Dmitry Grabay: it did not involve the Maine Research Corporation. On January 7, 1966, Louis Saralis announced that RCA Board of Directors voted to purchase the Lewiston Raytheon site, and Saralis confirmed he had reported the good news to his supervisors, the Lewiston Finance Board. Although Mayor Couturier and LDC President Roland Carbonneau refused to comment before the scheduled January 10th formal announcement at Stechino's restaurant in Lewiston, all that was now left regarding the mystery buyer were the details of the deal. What would not wait were the superlatives that described Saralis's role in securing RCA's interest in Lewiston. Finance board member, attorney Philip Isaacson, believed that the city should be appreciative of, quote, the full scope of his efforts and his energy, diligence, and skill to make the deal a reality, unquote, describing it all as, quote unquote, an astonishing performance. It was also reported that in response to the RCA announcement, Grabay might build his facility in Auburn. In some ways, the Stechino's luncheon felt very familiar with the spectacle of officials from a very large out-of-state corporation, in fact, a Fortune 500 firm that was the 24th largest US company in 1966, who were again in a Lewiston banquet room, mapping out a future with promises of over 1,000 high-tech jobs for LA area residents who would produce transistors for use in, quote, consumer, industrial, and military electronic equipment, unquote. The one exception to Raytheon, the most recent Fortune 500 company to make similar promises at a Lewiston banquet, was that RCA would produce silicon transistors, the same type that Raytheon said necessitated their relocation to Mountain View in 1963. RCA Vice President William H. Painter of the Commercial Receiving and Semiconductor Division focused his Stechino speech on the demand for RCA's product and the significant increases at the end of 1965. Painter said that his division was also responsible for manufacturing quote unquote memory products for computers that would be the focus of the work upon opening and would later transition into silicon transistor production. They also estimated that the level of employment could reach, quote, 1,400 to 1,600 people, unquote. At that time, this was not hyperbole from RCA. In July 1965, just 6 months before RCA's announcement, South Portland's Fairchild Semiconductor announced a $1 million expansion, quote, to meet production requirements, unquote, and increasing sales in their line of silicon transistors and semiconductors. Painter also shared that the Lewiston plant represented RCA's first main factory and, quote, part of RCA's $195 million, unquote, 1966 national expansion program. In Lewiston, they plan to invest some $4.1 million to acquire and fit up the facility for production, and Painter expected that this would happen immediately, adding that Lewiston would become RCA's fourth U.S. semiconductor plant. The praise heaped on Saralis's role for RCA's presence in that banquet room did not stop. Mayor Couturier would add his voice to the chorus of Saros supporters, as did Governor John Reed, who viewed the economic director's work as, quote unquote, a great accomplishment. Several days later, the praise regarding Saralis's involvement in recruiting RCA took on a very unexpected turn. According to several published newspaper accounts between January 16th and January 30th, 1966, and a January state DED report ordered by Governor Reed, the DED almost lost the RCA deal. According to the DED report received by Reed on January 20th, the RCA deal began when someone representing a large unidentified corporation contacted the DED on September 30th, 1965. They requested information about available plant space in Maine that included the Raytheon building in Lewiston. That was followed by another contact from those same corporate representatives on October 11th, 1965, asking for a tour of the Raytheon building on that same day. Following the site visit, the corporate representatives asked the DED tour guide, later identified as Raymond Curtis, what price would get the deal done. Curtis responded saying that the building's price was the LDC asking price. When the corporate reps said that the price was too high, Curtis responded that there was another prospective Maine facility that would meet their price. Curtis also said in the DED report that he had tried to reach Saralis before the tour, but was unable to reach him. Before leaving the Raytheon building, the mystery corporate reps and Ray Curtis decided to have lunch at the Auburn Holiday Inn near the I-95 Auburn exit. While they ate, Saralis entered the dining room and was surprised to see Curtis, who was sitting with his corporate guests. Curtis invited Saralis to sit and have coffee, then proceeded to summarize who his guests were, and shared with Saralis that they had just toured the Raytheon property. There are two accounts of what happened next during lunch. The DED report version states that Curtis advised Saralis that he told the representatives about the LDC asking price and the plant's quote-unquote unavailability that resulted in their removing the building from their search list. The Saralis version reported that Curtis made no mention of the asking price, but did say to Saralis that, quote, it was too bad that the Raytheon plant was unavailable, unquote. To which Saralis replied, quote, what do you mean unavailable? The plant is very much available, unquote. The issue of the plant's availability was being driven by Dmitry Grabet's public claims made after the RCA decision. Grabet said that both Raytheon and the LDC agreed to an option for the building, citing two letters he provided to Frank Sleeper of the Portland Sunday Telegraph. One was dated August 12th and the other August 18th, 1965. The first was addressed to Saralis and referenced a meeting with Governor Reed, citing an understanding by all parties that MRC would purchase the Raytheon building and property for $1.65 million. The second letter was written by LDC President Thomas Meneely. It confirmed that the LDC board had voted and agreed with Grabet's offer on the building and property. According to both of, quote, the photostats, Raytheon felt Maine Research Corporation had some commitment on the building until October 29th, and that the LDC felt MRC had first called to purchase the facility until December 6th. Grabet also confirmed that he was never able to, quote, obtain a written option to make the purchase, unquote. There were option negotiations between Grabet and the city following the August 18th letter, and they continued through October 11th, the day the corporate reps toured the Raytheon building. Grabet also stated that the LDC president informed him on October 12th, and likely during the state city-hosted event for the Grabet presentation at the bank, quote, that the full board of the LDC had accepted the proposal, unquote. According to Grebe, it was at this point that Saarlis also promised him, quote, a written agreement, unquote, that would be produced in 48 hours, but there was no DED report corroboration of Curtis telling the corporate reps, either during or after the Raytheon tour, about Grebe's claim that an option was agreed to by both the LDC and Raytheon. What is confirmed is that Curtis said it was unavailable. Grebe insisted that his version of events happened, but could not produce any additional written evidence. Weeks after the Raytheon tour, Grebe had not received a written option, purchase and sale agreement, or response from either Raytheon or the LDC until Lewiston finally advised Grebe that they were backing out of the deal. This could very well have occurred around December 19th, when the Portland Press-Herald reported that the city had critical problems with the MRC proposal. It should also be noted that DED Commissioner Standish Bachman agreed with the Governor Reed report, stating that DED official Raymond Curtis, quote, had fumbled in handling the negotiations, which eventually brought RCA to Maine, unquote. Governor Reed added that the confusion caused by the DED's handling of the RCA deal may, quote, have caused RCA officials to leave the state, unquote, because DED officials said that the Raytheon property was unavailable, and also never said why it was unavailable. There was also public support from RCA, who credited Saarlis, saying that his very influential involvement in the process, quote, helped RCA overcome the opposition from high-placed state officials, unquote, who preferred to see MRC in the building, a statement that Grebe would not refute publicly. This would explain why the city and Raytheon did not extend an invitation to the DED for the RCA announcement at Taquinos on January 10th, 1966. As difficult as it was for Grebe to accept what happened during his Raytheon negotiations, he would now be faced with abandoning a site that he had been working on for 10 months. But Grebe persisted, and it would not involve any discussions with Lewiston or Auburn officials. He would find a much more enthusiastic reception with Lewiston's adjoining neighbor to the south, Lisbon, Maine. Midsummer reporting from the Press-Herald shared that Lisbon could be the new home for MRC. 9 months after RCA's announcement officially ended Grebe's hopes of securing the Raytheon building, and with the help of the Lewiston Development Corporation and Senator Edward Muskie, Grebe received funding from a $1.5 million Federal Economic Development Administration loan and $243,000 raised by the Lewiston Development Corporation for his new high-tech company that was projected to employ up to 450 people. MRC held an open house for their new $2.6 million, 73,800 square foot building on April 15, 1968. They would manufacture, quote, printed circuits, wiring boards of two-sided and multi-layered design, unquote, using some of the most advanced production equipment that included a union carbide laser welder. But the open house also involved certain sections of the building that were not publicly accessible for national security reasons. MRC would manufacture products for the National Security Agency and other clients that required classified access. MRC grew, but employment would peak in 1970 at 225 people. By January 1971, reports about MRC's inability to pay its property taxes suggested that it was having financial problems. On May 5, 1971, Grebe announced that MRC was going to temporarily lay off 50 persons from its declining workforce of 130 employees, but also believed that, quote, an upswing in the industry was imminent, unquote. At the end of June 1971, Grebe admitted publicly that MRC potentially faced closure if it could not secure another $800,000 to produce orders that were waiting to be filled. Grebe would later say that 1969 was the only profitable year for the company, and that a, quote, collapse in the economy, unquote, produced losses for the last 2 years. Unable to secure funding, the banks foreclosed on the MRC building and property on December 9, 1971. The closure and Lisbon government's inability to recover The $160,000 in overdue Lisbon Mills Company property taxes was a blow to the town's budget. The simultaneous closing of the two businesses resulted in a 13% increase in the town's property tax rate. But things improved in May 1972 when the Lewiston Daily Sun reported that North American Rockwell would buy the MRC facilities and property. In July 1972, they renamed the operation Maine Electronics, that became part of Rockwell's Electronics Group and its Autonetics division, a unit that manufactured products for the Minuteman ICBM missile, the Polaris, Poseidon, and Trident submarines, and the F-111 bomber. The town would benefit from new property tax revenues, and employment projections of approximately 150 people was achieved by the beginning of 1973. North American Rockwell merged with Rockwell Manufacturing and changed their name to Rockwell International later in 1973. The new company became another Fortune 500 presence in the greater LA area, with its parent company generating $2.36 billion in 1973 US sales, making it the 44th largest corporation in the country. It was almost inconceivable that what was happening in Lisbon with MRC in 1972 was also happening with the Lewiston RCA in that same year. In both municipalities, buildings that had a connection to Grebet would close and be almost immediately purchased by a large national company that would outlive the building's former occupant. For RCA, its demise began a little more than a year after the Lewiston plant produced its 1 millionth transistor in August 1966. On September 11th, 1967, RCA said it would be, quote, phasing out, unquote, of the silicon transistor and semiconductor business, quote, over the next few months, unquote. And a small number of their 315 employee workforce would be laid off in semiconductor operations. By the end of 1968, the total number of employees was approximately 100. RCA looked for other Lewiston plant, quote unquote, product lines, but that never developed. In February 1970, RCA telegraphed their decision not to expand the Lewiston facility by leasing a part of the building to Liberty Mutual Insurance. Liberty projected employing up to 100 people while they looked for temporary space for a regional corporate unit in the area. Things became more challenging for RCA when workers went on strike on June 2, 1970. The national strike included Lewiston and RCA plants in 5 other states. The strike shut down the plant, and when the union rejected another offer from RCA, the local newspaper editorial board said that the strike's continuation could only, quote, do more harm, unquote, to the community. The newspaper believed the future success of Lewiston's plant could be compromised given that many RCA plants were, quote, well-established facilities, unquote. They also said that the plant, quote, never had a chance to get going, unquote, suggesting that RCA's inability to succeed would be hampered by Lewiston RCA employee participation in a national strike. The editor's position did not reflect the facts about RCA's history in Lewiston. The reality was that the company had pulled the plug on its transistor manufacturing in 1967, a year after producing its 1 millionth transistor and a year after Fairchild expanded its main facility. The semiconductor closure also resulted in the elimination of 2/3 of the Lewiston workforce. The strike was settled 76 days later on August 17, 1970, and on September 18, 1971, RCA would, quote, get out of the general computing manufacturing business, unquote. That was quickly followed by a September 20th, 1971 announcement that 75 people would be laid off in Lewiston, representing 26% of the total number in New England and about 35% of the total workforce in Lewiston. On January 1st, 1972, quote, another 40 workers, unquote, lost their jobs in Lewiston, lowering the workforce to about 100 people. RCA shut down operations and vacated the building in March 1972 after Liberty Mutual Insurance announced its purchase of the property in January. When Liberty Mutual signed and recorded the deed in March, RCA formally ended their relationship with Lewiston, making them the second Fortune 500 company to do so over the last 8 years, almost to the date. Liberty Mutual's choice to set up temporary quarters in available space within the RCA building in 1970 was a difference maker. Their decision not to rush their effort to find another permanent location, rumored to be Auburn in June 1971, possibly influenced RCA's decision to close the computer memory division in September 1971, encouraging RCA to close the outright sale of the property to one of the largest insurance companies in the United States, Liberty Mutual. Liberty Mutual projected that their new regional operation in Lewiston would employ another 300 or more people soon. Liberty also leased available space to the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston for a, quote, check clearing center, unquote, that was also conveniently located just 1 mile from Interstate 95. The facility became, quote, the first Federal Reserve property in the nation not to be established as a branch bank of a Federal Reserve Bank, unquote, and began operations in 1972. Liberty Mutual would go on to become the building's longest occupant. Everything associated with the Lewiston Raytheon building only happened because of the vision of residents who formed the LDC and Mayor Roland Marcotte's leadership to hire a city development director, all created in 1952. And beginning in 1952, the city and LDC recruited the Knapp Brothers Company to move their entire shoe manufacturing operation to Lewiston in 1953. And in the following year succeeded in attracting the New Jersey-based Geiger Brothers Company to Lewiston. The LDC, working with the IDD, then created the area's first business park in 1957, which became an immediate success. These events helped to diversify its economy and reshape the development trajectory of the city while also creating thousands of new jobs in Lewiston. All of this did not go unnoticed by Lewiston's Twin City neighbor, Auburn, who read the statewide newspaper stories of Lewiston's economic development activity, much of it beginning in 1954 following the Geiger and Knapp brothers' relocations to Lewiston. In January 1955, the Auburn Business Development Corporation, the ABDC, was created, and at the first meeting, quote, noted the success of the Lewiston Industrial Development Department headed by John J. Maloney Jr. Auburn's new civic organization would, quote, seek new and diversified industry for the shoe city, unquote, and enlisted financial support from the Auburn City Council. The ABDC quickly recruited political support for a new city industrial development position that would work closely with the city council. They also handled the initial duties of screening applications for the, quote, city's first industrial development director, unquote. The selection was a collaborative involving the ABDC, the Auburn city manager, and city council. On June 29, 1955, the city announced that L. Henderson Dudman was hired as the city's first director, who began his new municipal duties on July 15th. By 1956, there were reports of, quote, some confusion on the part of Dudman and whether he was responsible to the ABDC or to the city manager, unquote. That discussion involved the possible creation of an independent director's position so that the director could, quote, be divorced from politics, unquote, because it was important to recognize industrial development, quote, as a civic rather than a municipal endeavor, unquote. The proposal would mean that the director's position would no longer be a city employee and be directly supervised by the ABDC, who would report to the city council. The new arrangement also required the city to subsidize the ABDC and its new position. The Auburn City Council approved the budget for the restructuring of the development position that was now under the direction of the ABDC in April 1956. Things appeared to be in place for Auburn Development to set aside recent events and focus on industrial development in their city. But without explanation, Dudman turned in his resignation notice on September 18, 1956. and be replaced by Lindley Bond Jr., who was hired on October 10th, 1956. But 7 months later, Bond left the position, quote, for a better job, unquote, in Long Island, New York. Over the next 4 months, the challenge of holding onto a development director opened the door for unpublicized discussions between the ABDC and the Lewiston Development Corporation. They discussed a plan to create a joint independent industrial development director position and to hire Lewiston's industrial development director, Sam Michael, who would report to a newly created independent joint development committee. The quote unquote premature disclosure of these discussions would be front page news on September 14th, 1957, and the Lewiston Daily Sun editorial board supported the proposal and the hiring of Michael. The September 14th, 1957 article also reported that there was, quote, some opposition, unquote, to the merger proposal prior to a scheduled September 19th Lewiston City Council vote on a resolution supporting the joint development idea. Lewiston Alderman Jerry Clifford said he believed that a, quote, majority of the board, unquote, supported it, while the Lewiston Daily Sun confirmed that, quote, 4 of the 5 members of the finance board were also backing the proposal. Alderman Paul Couture offered his conditional support for the joint proposal, but only if the director was a municipal employee. The development merger also encountered some surprising opposition before the September 19th Lewiston City Council meeting. The LDC announced that it would now oppose the merger proposal they helped to create, believing that there was insufficient support from both the Lewiston mayor and aldermen. LDC also submitted a revised request seeking the city council's approval to have the IDD position mirror the ABDC's director, with Michael employed by the LDC, which in turn would report to the city council. The proposal was met with a quote unquote cool reception from the aldermen and received no further consideration. But the city council supported improving communications and working more closely with the LDC. Given the absence of support in Lewiston, the ABDC moved beyond the joint merger idea and met with their 5 recently elected councilors. The group gave the ABDC a, quote, vote of confidence, unquote, to find a new director, but encountered some concerns. In April 1958, the ABDC notified the council that they had interviewed many applicants with misgivings about the, quote, lack of financial security, unquote, in a position dependent on annual city council appropriations. Those concerns were short-lived when Afonso L. Tavares was hired by ABDC in May 1958, becoming the city's 3rd development director in 3 years. After being unable to fill a position for almost a full year, the ABDC and Tavares hit the ground running. In 1958, the city saw its first industrial park on Minot Avenue. The Army Reserve occupied the former Maine Baking Company in the new business park. Tavares took numerous development trips to New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. And efforts were underway to develop another industrial park at the airport. 1959 would begin with the ABDC's plan to build, quote, an industrial venture building, unquote, in Auburn. They also acted on their vision of an airport industrial park by purchasing a 140-acre parcel near the airport that could serve as a site for that first venture building or attract an outside industry. Also in 1959, Auburn made an 11th hour attempt to convince Raytheon to build in Auburn, but Raytheon would announce in July 1959 that Lewiston would become the location for its transistor manufacturing center. Disappointed, but not deterred, Auburn would press on with their plan to diversify their economy. By September 1960, quote, 3 new industrial or business buildings, unquote, were being planned in Auburn. And, quote, 2 of them would be in new buildings, unquote. A week after that announcement, the ABDC reported that its first new venture building in the new Minot Avenue Bossy Industrial Park would be occupied by Hamilton and Son Incorporated, an Auburn sheet metal firm. Like in Lewiston, the venture building would be built and owned by the ABDC. In that same week, Auburn City Councilor Harry Woodward announced that a company he also managed locally would build a new, quote, 12,000 square foot warehouse for the Dainty Bits Biscuits Company, unquote. That would be the company's third New England warehouse distribution center. The announcement was celebrated as yet one more exhibit of a growing wave of development interest in Auburn. Dainty Bits' history in Auburn went back to 1954, when Irving Rodman, quote, acquired control of the Car Consolidated Company's 3 warehouses in Auburn, Maine, West Roxbury, Massachusetts, and Providence, Rhode Island, that were distributing snack items, cookies, and crackers, unquote. And all produced by independent bakeries in Massachusetts. His New England company became M&I Products Distributing Company, and in 1956, Rodman incorporated under the name Dainty Bits. Also in 1956, a $500,000 Auburn Armory fire destroyed the entire armory structure and damaged the M&I Products Company warehouse on Troy Street, forcing them to relocate to temporary quarters at 74 Lake Street in Auburn. When Dainty Bits decided to build a new Auburn warehouse for its growing company in 1960, Rodman and Auburn officials believed that the project only involved a warehouse structure. But when Rodman began to consider building his own facility to bake his company's products, the city had a direct connection to Dainty Bits through an Auburn resident and then city councilor named Harry Bud Woodward, who was managing the 74 Lake Street Dainty Bits warehouse, having done so since 1954. Woodward would be on the city council during the years that Dainty Bits made its decision to build a warehouse and when the 1961 negotiations were taking place for a new factory that would bake its entire product line, eliminating the need to deal with multiple bakeries. The person that ended his part of the Dainty Bits negotiations was Industrial Development Director Al Tavares, who submitted his quote-unquote surprise resignation on March 20th, 1961. The resignation resulted in new city manager Woodbury E. Brackett convincing the city council to make the development position a city employee once again, and reporting directly to the city manager and council, but working closely with the ABDC, who became advisory only. The new city position was filled by D. Dwight Dougherty in December 1961 and be classified as an administrative assistant to the manager, while also doing the development quote-unquote legwork. City manager Brackett, Dougherty, ABDC, and their elected officials would all be part of a turning point in Auburn's development effort, but they would later discover that success would not insulate them from some disappointment. Auburn's efforts to develop a civic city-guided economic development strategy experienced its first major manufacturing success when Dainty Bits announced in April 1962 that it would build a 55,000 square foot bakery plant in place of the original 12,000 square foot warehouse. They declared that it would be, quote, the most modern cookie and cracker baking plant in New England, unquote. It was also the largest and most significant economic development success for the ABDC and the city's business diversity and development efforts going back to their beginning in 1955. The ABDC also coordinated the assembly of, quote, 125 Auburnites, unquote, who raised $80,000 in local pledges supporting the project, similar to what happened with multiple development projects in Lewiston through the creation of the LDC. The Dainty Bits factory groundbreaking took place on April 27, 1962, and involved Irving Rodman's partner, the Prince Spaghetti Company. The plant was built, outfitted, and became operational in fewer than 9 months. On January 6, 1963, 500 people were on hand to celebrate, quote unquote, Cookieville, USA, and to hear Rodman recognize Harry Woodward's, quote, important role in convincing him to locate in Auburn, unquote. The new company later announced the creation of a second shift in March 1963, and that it was producing, quote, 1.5 million cookies a week, unquote, while hoping to raise the current workforce of 60 persons to 125 soon. A little more than a year after Dainty Bits began operations, the unthinkable happened. Almost a year to the date after the Raytheon closing decision, Irving Rodman announced on March 6, 1964, that the company had, quote unquote, ceased production at the plant on March 4th, and that the company had run, quote, out of capital, unquote. The company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on March 13, 1964, and was rescued on October 8th by H.B. Hood and Sons Dairy, who purchased an 80% interest in the cookie company, leaving 10% for Irving Rodman, who issued the other 10% to his son-in-law. H.B. Hood then sold their interest to the company back to Rodman in July 1965. Rodman stated that he had, quote, secured sufficient financial backing, unquote, to continue operating, but his last-ditch effort to save the company failed, and Dainty Bits ended production on June 27, 1966. Rodman would say that he, quote, didn't have sufficient finances to continue, unquote, the operation. He also said that it was possible that the, quote, Small Business Administration would liquidate the plant, unquote. 1 week later, a Lewiston attorney was appointed by the Maine Supreme Court to handle the sale of the business and property. Although the perishable goods and personal property were liquidated, the building and property were sold in January 1967 to General Electric, quote, the fourth largest corporation in the world, unquote, but it was not the only large national company who decided to build in Auburn. As early as 1963, Pioneer Plastics, a subsidiary of Fortune 500 American Cyanamid Company, announced that it had intended to, quote, move its Sanford plant, unquote. On April 30th, 1964, Pioneer Plastics, the world's, quote, second largest manufacturing company of its type, unquote, decided it would build a $3.6 million 350,000 square foot facility in Auburn and locate it literally across from the Dainty Bits and future GE plant. And on February 13, 1967, in the same year, GE proclaimed that it would occupy the vacant Dainty Bits factory. The Lewiston Evening Journal reported that Tampax Incorporated would be constructing a 110,000 square foot manufacturing facility projected to employ up to 400 people and become one of 9 sites in the world to manufacture women's sanitary products. 3 large national companies, GE, Pioneer Plastics, and Tampax Incorporated, took up residence in Auburn between 1964 and 1967. And this accomplishment was directly tied to the ABDC and the city's commitment to diversify Auburn's economy. These projects also served to stimulate future development 2 miles southeast from Auburn's downtown, in an area around the old Dainty Bits Bakery off Rodman Road, a street named after Irving Rodman. Little did he know that his efforts to build a company would become the genesis for future development in that Auburn area 2.5 miles south near the Auburn-Lewiston Airport. That is where Tampax Incorporated purchased land to build their 1967 facility on airport acreage previously jointly owned by the cities of Lewiston and Auburn. For the Portland area, the April 1962 Fairchild Semiconductor decision to buy a speculative building in South Portland was the kind of success needed to redefine its area's economy. This new silicon transistor plant was the company's first venture out of California and a notable success for the greater Portland community, coming on the heels of their not being selected by Raytheon in 1959. Fairchild wasted no time getting started, and in June 1962 leased the former South Portland Park Motors auto dealership at 185 Ocean Avenue as a training facility for new employees. But why was Maine selected as this fledgling company's first site outside of California? The answer may lie in something as simple as the old adage, it's all about who you know. On December 4th, 1960, Portland's first national bank vice president, Ralph Harper, was called by his friend Charles Thomas with an invitation to come to his Westbrook home to meet Lee R. Swayze, who had grown up with Thomas, was raised by his mother in Westbrook, and attended Westbrook High School. Swayze also represented Fairchild's semiconductor division that was expanding its operations and considering, quote, 5 areas of the country, unquote. That included the greater Portland area. Swayze, quote, never lost his love for Maine, unquote, and listened to Thomas and Harper praise the Greater Portland Area Development Council's, the ADC, business development efforts that included New England's largest speculative building, recently constructed in South Portland, something that also encountered criticism from the other 12 greater Portland communities who were also interested in the project. Harper brought the news to ADC manager Eugene Martin, and both reached out to the Fairchild executives in California, which included Dr. Robert Noyce, who would later be recognized as, quote, the father of the integrated circuit, who both conceived of the monolithic idea, unquote, and also invented the means to manufacture it using, quote, the planar process, unquote. Harper and Martin received no response from Fairchild for about a year, but that changed in November 1961, when the Portland Press Herald reported that a quote-unquote blind letter from an unidentified company was received by Maine DED's Irving C. Davis, who then responded, quote, to the unidentified parties, unquote, with information, quote, including the story of Maine's 2 speculative industrial buildings, unquote, in Waterville and South Portland. On December 8, 1961, the unidentified parties contacted ADC manager Eugene Martin to tell him that they were interested in the South Portland property. The letter from a Palo Alto, California address, quote, sought facts about the Portland area's labor force, unquote, and both Martin and Ralph Harper had reason to believe that it came from Fairchild, who had a facility, the original 1957 location, in Palo Alto. Another letter from Palo Alto was sent to Martin on January 5, 1961, telling Martin they had been looking at facilities in 16 states. They wanted more information about whether the Portland area had, quote, an adequate labor supply available at reasonable cost, unquote. Martin, who was the ADC manager in 1959, and the DED were acutely aware that lower labor cost in Lewiston was the primary factor behind Raytheon's decision not to locate in Portland. But the DED and Martin also knew that Lewiston was now off the table, as Raytheon would be fully operational in 1961, and that Lewiston did not have a ready-to-go speculative building available. They both also had knowledge of the Raytheon 1959 Arthur D. Little Maine Labor and Site Report that also had other market information available from this 2-year study that actually recommended Portland for the Raytheon project in 1959. The profiles of Greater Portland and Lewiston were very similar in that study, but according to Raytheon, the 1959 wage rates in both areas were a, quote, hair better in Lewiston, unquote. ADC also commissioned the Arthur D. Little Group in 1960 for their own Greater Portland market study. It determined that the labor situation in the area was far more attractive for a growth company like Fairchild. The study revealed that the, quote, Greater Portland area had shown a population increase of almost 40% since 1940, unquote, and was also growing faster than Cumberland County and projecting to get younger by 1970. The DED monthly mailer Maine Developments also reported that Commissioner Lloyd K. Allen's department had been contacted by D.M. Coburn's November 1961 blind letter because of their, quote, advertisement in the industrial trade magazine Plant Location, unquote. The real question is, would Fairchild have noticed or cared about anything going on in Maine had Raytheon not built in Lewiston? There was a mountain of Arthur D. Little Portland survey data and many articles articulating Raytheon's praise of the Maine workforce. Did that data and praise move the needle for Fairchild, or did Lee Swayze's employment with Fairchild and upbringing in Westbrook help to get their attention fully a year before the blind letter? Or was it possible that the South Portland speculative building venture promoted in the DED advertisement seen by Fairchild in 1961 become the variable that, according to Fairchild's statements, triggered the blind letters? It is very possible that the Raytheon deal, the Arthur Little studies, and the speculative building all contributed to Fairchild's decision to open its first out-of-state manufacturing facility in Maine. But I would argue that Raytheon's 1959 decision to build in Lewiston was the signal flare that first caught Fairchild's attention. In 1959, Fairchild had just built a manufacturing plant in Mountain View, California. In 1960, Raytheon began negotiations and succeeded in purchasing Mountain View competitor Rheem Semiconductor. This is notable in that Rheem had been started by 13 former Fairchild staff in 1959, some who may have communicated to Fairchild about Raytheon's interest in Maine. All of this took place before the Fairchild announcement was made in April 1962. I submit that had Raytheon not built in Maine, there may have been less urgency for the ADC to seek an updated Arthur Little study or to build a 1960 speculative building, the one that reportedly was discussed with Swayze and generated Coburn's blind letter in 1961. Had the studies in venture building not happened, Fairchild may have not only passed over Greater Portland, but the entire state of Maine. After Fairchild opened operations in its Portland plant on January 1st, 1963, the company went through several rounds of ownership that maintained its place in electronics history as a South Portland semiconductor chip manufacturing site 60 years later. Quite an achievement given the volatile nature of the semiconductor chip business, something that Fairchild experienced in 1975 when the industry, quote unquote, bottomed out. In 1976, when the South Portland plant laid off workers. In 1977, when net income for the parent company dropped nationally and poor performance in its digital watch sales became a financial drain. And in 1978, when analyst reports believed that Fairchild's financial future was, quote, one of the poorest of the major semiconductor companies, unquote, in the country. It also did not help that, quote, 28% of Fairchild's pre-tax income, unquote, that generated royalty patents revenue would come to an end in 1979, that Japanese were gaining in the semiconductor market. And according to Robert Noyce, quote, the combination of cost inflating government regulations and higher taxes, unquote, were eroding American entrepreneurial creativity and investment. In response, Fairchild Camera and Instrument Corporation, the company that owned Fairchild Semiconductor, agreed to a May 1979 $363 million purchase offer from Schlumberger Limited that would also end a takeover threat from Gould Incorporated in Chicago. Schlumberger preserved the Fairchild Semiconductor name and turned it into, quote, the sixth largest US semiconductor maker, unquote. But it later became a loser when National Semiconductor purchased the company in September 1987 for $122 million and retired the historic Fairchild Semiconductor name. This was followed by the purchase of National Semiconductor's majority ownership interest in June 1996. A new South Portland privately held management-led investment group raised $550 million for two of the three National Semiconductor South Portland buildings, several overseas facilities, and resurrected the Fairchild Semiconductor name for what would now become a worldwide company. In 1998, Fairchild bought the remnants of what remained with the Mountain View Raytheon semiconductor plant and their transistor semiconductor business and would go public in 1999. The South Portland Investment Group sold Fairchild to On Semiconductor in 2016 for $2.4 billion. The Phoenix-based company made Fairchild a wholly owned subsidiary that would no longer be traded as a public company. On Semiconductor then sold to Diodes Incorporated in 2022 for an undisclosed price and remains in business in South Portland as of this video. In 1996, the Encyclopedia Britannica stated that Fairchild's South Portland location was the longest operating semiconductor manufacturing facility in the world. It is likely that some 27 years later, their record remains unchallenged. A final note. Lewiston developer Dave Gendron bought the Liberty Mutual property in March 2012, and Liberty later vacated the property in 2022. SPI Global, the last tenant of the former Raytheon property, who first leased the space in 2019, was scheduled to leave the property in July 2023. Gendron is currently uncertain about the future of the structure. As for the three national companies that located in Auburn between 1964 and 1967, they continue to operate to this day, as does Geiger Brothers in Lewiston, who was the first significantly new industry to arrive in LA in 1954. Although the Knapp Shoe Factory is now closed, the building was updated and is now occupied by Central Maine Healthcare. It also houses the Dempsey Center Lewiston location. This was the first location for the Dempsey Center, quote, founded in 2008 by actor and Maine native Patrick Dempsey, with the mission to help make life better for people impacted by cancer, unquote. Sadly, Maine Electronics would officially announce the closing of its Lisbon plant on July 27, 1989, and all that is now left on the formerly contaminated site is open land. And even if Dmitry Grabe did not achieve success with his Maine Research Corporation, his pioneering work is responsible for some 500 electric patents that made significant contributions to the US space program. As for Fairchild and Intel co-founder Robert Noyce, he and his wife Elizabeth Noyce would divorce in 1975. Elizabeth would take up residence in their summer home in Bremen, Maine. Having received half of her husband's assets in the divorce settlement, Noyce donated millions to a variety of charities and Portland and Lewiston projects. Following her death in 1996, she created the Libra Foundation, which continues her charitable work to this day. And we end this Raytheon series with a tip of the cap to Elmet Technologies in Lewiston. This company was never mentioned in the Raytheon series, but its place in the city's manufacturing history cannot be overlooked, as it may now be the oldest manufacturing company in Lewiston or Auburn. The company arrived in Lewiston in 1929 as the new American Electro-Metal Corporation and was the first plant in the US to produce molybdenum wire used for lighting, radio tubes, and other products. They built their first factory at 1560 Lisbon Street and remained on that site through several ownership changes, beginning with North American Phillips Corporation's purchase in 1942. They changed the name to North American Phillips Elmet Division in 1942, and that would change again in 1961 to the Phillips Elmet Corporation, who was also doing business with Raytheon before they arrived in Lewiston. Former Phillips employee Jack Jensen purchased the company from Phillips Electronics North America in 2003 and renamed it with its current name, Elmet Technologies Incorporated. Jensen then sold the company to investment firm Anania and Associates Investment Company, LLC, in 2017. If the good Lord's willing and the creek don't rise, the company in 2029 will have 100 years of continuous operation in Lewiston on the same site where their first factory was built. I hope you enjoyed this 4-part series about the Lewiston and Maine Raytheon experience. In episode 5 of Deconstructing Lewiston-Auburn and Maine history, we will examine Maine's first organized refugee resettlement involving the Cuban refugees during the 1961-63 period, and the state's first large resettlement of refugees escaping Vietnam in 1975, and the organizations and people that made it all happen. I hope to see you soon.